Rhetoric, Disability Studies, and Critical Pedagogy in an accessible yet groundbreaking body of articles, talks, and workshops. A fierce advocate for disability rights, he's committed to publishing open access and accessible material and helped author the International Guidelines for Accessible Electronic Books. Leading by this example, Dr. Dolmage's second book, Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education, was published with Michigan University Press in 2017 and is available in an open access version online. I know many of us are looking forward to learning more from Dr. Dolmage over the next hour. And again, we would like to welcome you to Wright State. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Some of you also were involved yesterday, and some of you weren't, and that's great. So yesterday we kind of went through a series of metaphors. So there's a kind of structure for what we're going to do today that we're borrowing back from yesterday, thinking about accessibility and inclusion. And also ableism through three different particular kind of like time frames, that being before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID, but also thinking about through a few different metaphors that I have for the spaces of higher education, using these kind of architectural metaphors or spatial metaphors to think about how ableism has kind of defined higher education. In the book Academic Ableism, I make that larger argument, not just that higher education is ableist, right, has kind of perpetuated forms of ableism, but also in a way that it relies on ableism. The kind of false meritocracy of higher education, it relies on, portioning out privilege to a few, right, and also restricting that privilege and kind of sorting the population. So the image that we used for that yesterday, and I'll ask Tom if he doesn't mind advancing the slide, the steep steps image that we had was from your new Student Success Center or renovated Student Success Center. It's an impressive set of stairs. So it's concrete stairs. It's a large flight of stairs that leads from one floor to the next with a kind of stopping point halfway up. It's surrounded on both sides by what looks like steel, corrugated steel, bright yellow or green siding, and there's a railing on the right-hand side of the image. The interesting thing about this staircase is that it gives you access to a view out of the building, a kind of what I would imagine is a pretty impressive view out a big glass wall, a big wall of glass windows. The other thing about that is that I'm sure that as you approach the building, you can see this staircase kind of floating in space through that glass wall. So architecturally, it's pretty impressive from the outside and the inside. It's a kind of part of the central message that a Student Success Center is trying to offer around kind of metaphors of mobility and, pulling yourself up the stairs by the bootstraps. And so that steep steps metaphor I chose, right? And I didn't get to visit your campus, which is kind of a shame because I would really like to do that. But I want to ask you if you can think of other examples of stairs like this on campus that you've had contact with that are similarly, symbolic, that have a similar sort of presence on campus and central kind of message within buildings on campus. So I want to just kind of throw that back to you. And you could type in the chat, or people could volunteer to kind of share examples of other sets of stairs on campus. The other way to come at this is like you could say, no, you've done a pretty good job. This is a good example. Or you could tell me something else about this staircase that I don't know because I'm not on campus.
Hey, Jay, we got a couple of replies. The main stairs in the library, the student union, and then also central stairs in the library under the Wright flyer.
Okay.
So 2 examples from the library. We had another one just come in. The physics chemistry building has narrow windows, dark enclosed staircase, very Cold War. That's a good analogy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, my own campus is very Cold War as well, very a brutalist, and in that architectural style, there are stairs everywhere, concrete stairs, kind of ruffling out in all directions on my own campus as well. It's in a way, it's how you make a building look interesting from the outside. You smack a whole bunch of stairs on it. Okay, so with this in mind, all right. Yesterday we talked about some, and I went through some of the research and the data, just on how difficult it is for disabled students in higher education. That we're losing a lot of students. We have a generation of students who are experiencing higher education as disabling, and yet they're less likely than previous generations of students to ask for help. Talked about the fact that students with disabilities graduate with 60% more student debt if they do graduate, but that the graduation rates are very low, the retention rates are very low for disabled students. And so in a way, this staircase metaphor shows us just the kinds of barriers that are placed in front of disabled students and the ways that they're not climbing, right? The ways that they're being excluded. So the activity for you for this first kind of section, forgive me, don't be intimidated because I'm an unbelievably good artist, but I'm going to draw a little picture for you. I'm going to show it here. And your picture doesn't have to be as good as mine, but well, actually I should use a marker maybe. If you can't see, what I've done is I've drawn a set of stairs. All right, and this is a two-dimensional drawing of a staircase going up from the left to the right. I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4 stairs, okay? If you can, draw that same picture, or you can visualize that picture. And the activity is to think, for you in your own educational history, what were some of the forces that helped you get up these stairs, right? If we're thinking metaphorically of the stairs as a climb up the towards the ivory tower, right? What were some of the things that helped you get up the stairs? But also, what were some of the forces that pushed you back? Were there people or resources that helped you? Were there things that got in your way? And also thinking, part of the talk yesterday was talking about just how, some people are very prepared for higher education because of their background, and other people aren't. And some people, when they get to campus, they have to navigate all other kinds of things like racism, like poor access to housing, right? Or they may be working all their way through their undergrad degree. Where do you start? Where do you feel like you started on these stairs, right? And where do you find yourself now? So that's the activity. I want people to just take a few minutes to think about this. One thing you could do is you can just draw arrows going down and arrows going up, and just try to label those, right? What are some of the things that the barriers that you've experienced, and what are some of the ways that you've been helped in your own educational journey? So I'll give people a little bit of time to think about that, and then if people want to share, then we can use the chat for that.
So just so everyone knows, some people seem to have trouble with the chat. So I am going to read anything that shows up in the chat, and Evan is going to read anything that shows up in the QA section. So we'll try to alternate and hit everybody.
Okay, are people ready to start sharing some thoughts here?
Yeah, I can chime in. Lisa Kelly put in the Q&A that the steps reflect the goals going upward, and then that coming down reflects accomplishment.
Yeah. So
Colleen,
it's interesting. Yep. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, Colleen Floyd put in the chat, testing requirements force disability disclosure in order to receive accommodations.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more throughout the workshop. But that idea that the help that I'm asking where people found help, right? But the truth is, I also said that students are less likely to seek help nowadays, and that's historically true as well. And in part, that's because help can be hard to find, and it doesn't always match with what students need. I had a really interesting metaphor that I heard from a disabled student about the process of going into the Disability Services Office. And the student used the metaphor that it was like playing the game Battleship. So if anyone's played the game Battleship, it's this game where you have a screen in between yourself and the person that you're playing with, right? On your side, you've got your ships arranged, and you kind of throw something over the screen, right, to try to land on the battleships on the other side. But you don't know where they are, so you're guessing, right? And the student said, in disability services, it felt like they were lobbing a diagnosis over the screen and hoping that it would land on something on the other side. And so I think the comment gets at the fact that it feels very risky to kind of lob a diagnosis over that screen, and that students don't always find something on the other side that's going to help in the ways that they expect it to. So I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure if there are other things there. But Angie, please, go ahead if there are other things showing up there.
We had another comment from Emily. Nobody told me that accommodations were something I was allowed to pursue because I didn't fit the assumed image of what a disabled student looked like. Yes.
So one of the statistics I gave the other day is and I'm just going to quickly find it here. Where is it? I'm not going to find it right away. Sorry. Up to 2/3 of disabled college students don't receive accommodations because their colleges don't know about their disabilities. Or another way to say that is, up to 2/3 of students are in that same position, Emily, where they don't know how to ask for help, and where the ways that they see themselves don't match with the ways that disability is represented, right? The other statistic is that there's so many more students with what we might call invisible disabilities. Has become a much larger percentage of disabled college and university students than it was in the past.
We have another comment from Maya saying, I found help from a teacher who understood that I focused better while doing something else, even if it makes it look like I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, that's terrific. And that's actually true, I think, for a lot of learners, right? But that's not necessarily something that teachers are going to be trained or likely to necessarily understand. Unfortunately, most of the time, the instructors that we have not been given a lot of training around teaching, and so for good reason, they assume that other learners learn the way that they do, right? But the problem then is that we get a very narrow kind of perception of how learning happens, because it's really only the people who've been successful within a pretty conservative system. They keep kind of perpetuating that pretty conservative system. And in that way, it really halts change, right? And it can really disadvantage students whose learning doesn't fit within that kind of narrow realm. I think the other thing about the staircase is that it's very narrow, right? There are only certain ways to succeed. It's a very narrow staircase. Okay, well, if we can, I'll move us along to the next metaphor here. And that is, you know, if we can kind of understand this backdrop of the steep stairs, we do have systems in place that help us to retrofit them, right? They help us to create accessibility after the fact. So one of those ways, most commonly on university campuses like my own that have stairs all over the place, is that we do have an accessible entrance, but it's hard to get to. You know, in the building that I work in, there's a giant set of stairs on the outside of the building, and the wheelchair accessible entrance is actually around the back in a freight entrance. And the only elevator in the building is actually a freight elevator. So it's kind of a dangerous elevator to ride in. It's often broken down. You'd be sharing it with people who are accepting shipments and so on. And it's at the very, very, very furthest end of the building. So if you want to use it, you have to, if you're working in the part of the building that I am, you have to actually travel, you know, 400 meters to get to the elevator, ride it all the way up if it's working, and then come back through a series of hallways and connecting hallways to get to that part of the building. So it's accessible, right? It measures up to the law, but it puts students with disabilities in that, you know, metaphor there, in a position where they might have access to the same things, but the toll, right, what they're expected to do to get that access is extraordinary. And over time, that has a function of wearing those students out. And the same can be said for a lot of the accommodations that we have in North American society. They're there, but they're just much more difficult to get and often risky to get. So that's part of what I want us to think about next, is this idea that when we talk about disability, it's often after the fact. We have a dominant way of doing things, and then we have a statement on the end of the syllabus that says, if you need something different, you have to go and follow these channels to get that different thing. Part of the function of the retrofit then is that it doesn't change anything. The retrofit, you know, the ramp around the back of the building ensures that the stairs never get torn down. It allows the stairs to be there, right, legally. And I think that happens very often in our classroom. Another, you know, I already gave the metaphor of the game Battleship, but I don't know if anyone's ever played the carnival game Whack-A-Mole. It's this game where, you know, you're standing in front of a board and these little rodents pop up and you smack them with a hammer whenever they pop up. But that can be an instructor's approach to disability. They want to assume that there's nobody with a disability in their class. And when that disability does pop up, they kind of hit it with an accommodation, and that's it. They hope that it goes away. And the result over time is, like I said, a very conservative system where teaching doesn't change to reflect the diversity of the students in the classroom. And the accommodation model, the retrofitted model, it ensures that nothing really has to change, that the teacher doesn't have to change. Because the accommodation is temporary, because it's isolated to a single student, we get a system that where change doesn't have to happen. That said, I think those retrofits and those accommodations, they are the way that students stay in school, right? They are important. People need them. And that's my next question for you all. What are some of the accommodations that you all create for yourself, or that you've had created for you, that you found most useful, right? We already had an example, I think, from Emily about being able to work in a semi-distracted type of way, right? I will say, you know, the other way to look at this, I think that's interesting, is for a lot of people, because of the pivot to online education during COVID, we all live with other learners in ways that we didn't before. I know that in my own house, there are times when there are 5 different people on computers learning, right? 5 different people working on assignments that are due at a certain time. And the interesting thing about that is when you live in close proximity with other learners in that way, you see that your way of learning is not the only way. And that other people can be successful or, you know, or unsuccessful, but that they are going to learn in a variety of different ways. And that's such a powerful thing, because I don't think we get that perception in most of higher education. The sense is that there's a very narrow way to learn, and that if you can't accommodate yourself to that narrow way of doing things, then you're not going to be successful. So this is my next challenge then, is to think about some of those retrofits, some of those accommodations that you've had, that you wish you've had, and kind of, I think in sharing those, we can move towards a kind of philosophy where we're trying to build those things in from the beginning rather than doing them only after the fact. So what are the ramps? While you're working there, I'll give my description here. I should have given it right away, but what we're seeing here is the external stairs up to that Student Success Center. It's a really interesting design, because you do have a central staircase that leads straight up to the front door, but crisscrossing back and forth through those stairs are a series of ramps that kind of switch back up this hill. There's railings on either side of them. It's a beautiful design. It incorporates landscaping, trees, and gardens. But the truth is, the stairs go directly up to the door, and the ramps take a very circuitous route. So it would take much longer to use the ramps than it would to use the stairs. That said, I think this is a pretty elegant example of a retrofit. And maybe there are examples of retrofits and accessible entrances that happen for you all on campus that aren't so elegant, and it would be fine to share those too.
We have a couple items in the chat. One person rented a private office in an almost empty building to complete my PhD. I also got a dog to keep me company. In addition to complete both my undergraduate and doctoral thesis, I have either borrowed or been prescribed stimulant medication.
That's sorry, if I could just say, that's how I finished my PhD too. I was able to access my office at night, and I went there with my dog. That was the only time my dog could come to the office with me. And that's really how I wrote my PhD, in between about 10 o'clock at night and 4 in the morning with my dog in an empty office, a completely quiet office. And you think about that, and then you think about where people are working. Like I just said, 5 people in a house, all on different computers, trying to learn at the same time. And if that kind of environment that was described is what you need, that's not there for very many people right now. That's much more difficult to come by. Even faculty are not allowed. I'm not allowed to go into my own office on campus. Nobody's allowed to. And so those things, those ways that we accommodate ourselves to be successful are taken away. And that should cue us to understand that lots of people have never had those things.
Colleen wrote, extended deadlines and modified assignments, multiple modalities of submitting my work. Examples are video essay, podcasts, poem, presentation instead of a written essay.
Those sound terrific. Yeah. Even just the simple idea of having an extended deadline, I think, is really powerful. And I talk with folks in STEM about this all the time, because their deadlines are often really very strict. That despite the fact that nobody ever walks into an engineering firm and says, okay, whatever bridge you all have, put your pencils down, whatever bridge you designed is the one that we're going to use. It's not like a cooking show. Professionals take the time that they need, and they know the time that they need to do something really well. Similarly, I can't walk into any of my faculty colleagues' offices and say, I'm going to come back in 50 minutes or a week and a half, and you need to have a publishable article. Those people actually extend their deadlines all the time, and they do it to do the work that is the best work they can do. So it's a cultural shift that we need to be pushing for. And if one person can have an extended deadline, then why can't more people? If the goal is to do the best work, the most careful and diligent work that we can do. There certainly is really a theme around timing. Yesterday I was talking about the fact that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of accommodations that students are given are just extended time on tests and exams. And why are we having timed tests and exams to begin with? If you go and do a dive into the educational research, so there's this myth, right? There's a myth that if you give a timed test or exam, that stress will make students study harder, perform better, and thus remember the information that they basically memorized in short order for longer. And that's the lore around it, right? That's why people defend doing it. But the educational research shows that none of those things are true. Students do not study harder, they do not retain more information, and they don't perform better. So none of those things work, right? Yet we make students prove that they deserve to get an accommodation like that. It's a soapbox issue for me, but what I would love to see is professors have to justify giving those exams. And like I said, there'd be no educational research they could draw on to justify giving a high stakes test or exam, a timed test or exam. In fact, when you dig into that research, the only thing that a timed test or exam does is it reinforces biases and discrimination that existed previous to the exam. So if you wanted to disadvantage students from particular class or ethnic background, the best way to do it is to give a timed test or exam. And yet, like I said, the onus becomes on the student to prove that they deserve extra time, not on the instructor to prove that there's any educational value to doing that.
What about nursing or other high stakes work environments?
Sure. So that's another justification people have, is that, you know, the high pressure of this is going to be something that's maybe not perfectly replicable in the professional world, but that there are professions where that has to happen, right? Where students need to be prepared for that stress. But to me, I think universities can be more creative. We have all these different ways of doing experiential learning. We have co-ops, we have internships, we have community-based learning. We have all these rich, kind of thick ways to invest in that kind of professional practice. And yet we act like 50-minute block tests or exams are somehow a reliable replication of that kind of professional practice, when we know that they're not. They're still so abstracted from that professional context. And nursing, I think, as a really good example, when there have been really good studies done with students in a medical setting, there are accommodations that really help them, right? Accommodations around taking really good notes or recording interactions, accommodations around memory, right? Where they may not be able to easily recall and memorize details, but if they have technology that can help them with that, then it can remove that barrier for them. So the accommodations that would actually help, right? We don't use very often, and we don't get students practicing asking for those accommodations or using them in a professional context. Again, like I said, instead we invest 70 to 75% of our time working in this classroom setting to give extra time on a classroom test. I think if we were empowered to take those resources and that expertise and apply them to more real settings, then we'd be giving students much more practice in asking for what they need in those settings. It's not that they're not going to need accommodations, it's that those accommodations are going to be different. The repertoire of accommodations that we have is really narrow, and if we could expand it and make it broader, then I think we could have a real impact.
We have another comment in here. So movement breaks for times that you're sitting still for too long or times of a lot of stress.
Absolutely, that's a terrific one. And nobody builds that into, for instance, Zoom. And when they do, it's revolutionary. I don't know if anybody else has been in a Zoom meeting or a class where you were given like 5 minutes to just get up and move around. But it's really welcome when you do it. And I think we need to be able to start building that kind of thing into the classroom, into the learning we do. this is kind of a non sequitur, but I think maybe hopefully an informative one. I don't know if people have ever watched the movie Monsters University, but in that movie, the very opening scene of the movie, well, it's a really powerful movie for a variety of ways. One of which is that, you know, it's located on a really traditional campus. So the Pixar animators, they looked at like Harvard and Stanford. It's this Gothic architecture. It's a very old-fashioned looking campus, not like Wright State, right? It doesn't have the tunnels. It doesn't have ramps. It has stairs everywhere. And then you take all these monsters bodies, and you put them in the space, and they don't fit, right? And a big part of the movie is about how they don't fit in this traditional structure. But in the very beginning of the movie, there is a slug monster, a slug-like monster, and we hear these bells going off, and everybody is rushing to get to class. And the slug is rushing as well. He's got his backpack on and all that, but he's not getting very far. And the joke, I guess, it's a long joke, but at the very end of the movie, we come back and it's been an entire year. Students have graduated or dropped out. All these things have happened, and we see the slug still trying to get to class. To me, it's powerful because it just shows how much of higher education is based on really weird and arbitrary sense of timing, right? That thinking can only happen in these little 50-minute chunks. And that we have to move bodies all through this space to get into these little time windows where thinking and expression and learning have to happen, right? Which is not very much of a reflection of the kind of modern world of work. That's not how we even want people thinking or focusing in the kind of quote unquote real world. So to me, it's upsetting, right? Because so many disabled students, they experience that timing and that need to kind of move around to fit into these pockets of time as real barriers to education. And it becomes more difficult when we realize that that is nothing like the world of work. It might have been something like the world of work about 100 years ago or 80 years ago, but it really doesn't reflect the ways of thinking, the flexibility, the collaboration, the communication that is required in a modern workplace. I see another comment from Seth Gordon here, and I think that's really interesting. The kind of bias and internalized stigma around even asking for help. It's something that I touched on yesterday. I think it's a generational thing, but I think it's also, you know, the fact that disability is not seen as central to higher education means that students who have received help for their disabilities previously in their lives, they don't seek that same help when they come to university because there is this stigma built in there, right? And that their accomplishments would be diminished somehow if they asked for help, which again is not really good preparation for the quote unquote real world, right? We need to learn as a culture how to ask for help. We need to be a good employee, you need to be able to ask for help, right? To be a good entrepreneur, you need to be able to ask for help. In fact, most of entrepreneurship is about asking for help. But the culture of higher education reinforces the opposite message. And that I think is problematic. So how do we build a culture where the door to help is right there and accessible to all students, and that they can see, for example, disabled faculty, you know, other disabled students, and have mentors and have visible, you know, examples of people asking for help so that we can attempt to kind of try to destigmatize that. I think doing that would go a really long way, but it's a big cultural shift.
Jay, we had a question come in a little bit
Sure.
earlier, but I think now would be a good time to pop it in. Do
Yeah.
you think there are more students with disabilities or just more knowledge of and discovery of disability?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So if you read in the popular media, right? If you just followed the New York Times or the Washington Post or USA Today or whatever your media, CNN, whatever wherever you're looking, there are stories that come up every 3 or 4 months, and this has been happening for 4 or 5 years, where they basically paint this picture of this kind of like huge influx of disabled students in higher education. The interesting thing is that the real data shows those numbers aren't going up very much. In the context of Ontario, the province where I teach, in fact, the numbers of disabled students are going down slightly year over year. We have more students coming into higher education than we've ever had before. But as a percentage of that number, disabled students, it's not going up, right? So with that said, there are disabilities now that we recognize that we didn't recognize 20 years ago. Though it doesn't mean those students weren't there before. It means that it was very difficult for them to be successful, right? It means that we may have lost a lot of those students. But my strong feeling is, and I gave you the statistic earlier, that up to 2/3 of students with disabilities never seek accommodations. My sense is that we're losing a large number of disabled students. And that's the way that I would want to frame it. It's not that there's this kind of scary influx of disabled students. It's that we still have a long way to go because we're not retaining those students. They're not seeking help. They're struggling. The financial burden is higher on them, like I mentioned, and they're not finishing their degrees. The rate of completion is so much lower for the ones that we do know about, which I think we should assume that we're losing a lot more of the students that we don't know about. The other important framing for me around that is that I've noticed this trend where everything that we do for the kind of generic student or the generic sense of education within a state or a country or a classroom, all the investment that we make or all the money that we put into it is seen as an investment. And for some reason, the money or the resources that we put for disabled students is seen as a drain, right? Somehow it's constructed differently, but all of the resources we put into education is an investment. And the loss of this what I would estimate is in the tens of thousands of disabled students every year, there's a huge intellectual cost to that loss. But it never gets framed that way. In fact, we get a sense that it's natural or normal, that we're losing those students, not because the university is a poorly designed space, but in fact, because it's a space that's designed to eject them, that they somehow don't deserve to be there. And I find that really, really problematic. So the reframing I would like to see, and I think especially for a school like Wright State or many other schools where they've seen a slight dip in enrollments, is if we can change the structure so that it's more inclusive, more accessible, then we're going to retain all of that intellectual potential, right? That's so valuable. And on the flip side, if we don't change, the only thing that's certain is that we're going to continue to lose those people and lose that potential.
Lynn put a comment in the chat on the concept of having disabled faculty as examples. My intro to sign language professor was deaf, so from day one, we only signed in class. Immersion learning at its best. Steep learning curve, but accelerated learning.
Absolutely. I took my ASL classes at Cincinnati State University, where all of the instructors are deaf, and it was an unbelievable learning experience, in part because it was different. It was very different to be obviously like a linguistic minority, but to be learning language in that immersive environment was so motivating, and it was the right way to learn, right? But those sorts of experiences, unfortunately, are too few and far between. And we need to look at the ways that we can retain disabled faculty, accommodate faculty. We've talked a lot about the accommodations process for students, but most universities don't have an accommodations process for faculty or for graduate students. And again, the result will be that we lose these people. So maybe are we ready? Well, I'm going to move us along to our, final metaphor, and that is of universal design. And the example we used yesterday is of the tunnels between buildings at Wright State, which I guess historically probably were first used for plumbing and electrical, to get things from building to building, but that at some point, actually quite early on at Wright State, it was understood that they could really increase accessibility. And that is in part how they're used now. This image shows the tunnels, a kind of panoramic image of the tunnels with a lot of bodies in motion. So it gives the sense that people are really getting from place to place, but it also shows people stopping and chatting, people resting, people sharing notes, conversing, studying, and it's all different types of people, right? So the combination, the fact that those might have been there for accessibility first, for disabled people first, leads to the fact that there are all these other positive uses that everybody can see. And that distills some of the philosophy around universal design, which is this idea that from the beginning, if we design things with and for disabled people, they'll be more accessible to everybody. And I want to talk through a few specific classroom examples of universal design. I'll give an example of my own to begin with, but I'm hoping that other people could share some of these examples of universal design. I want to kind of admit that probably for a decade of my teaching career, there was one particular aspect of my teaching that was really inaccessible and really poorly thought out. And that was around participation. Okay, so I taught classes where I gave a participation grade and I hardly even thought about it. It really boiled down to who spoke in class. And I gave that grade, I assessed that grade basically as I was submitting my grades. I'd think back and I'd be like, who was the most active participant in the class, and they'd get the highest grade, right? Which is a real problem because there's only so much space for people to speak in class. And when you're rewarding that with a grade, you actually reward the kinds of students who will speak over other students. You also you're not rewarding listening, which might be more valuable, right? And students can then just kind of look for their opportunity to talk. And that really wasn't a good way to teach participation at all. It was creating a lot of barriers, right? So when I began teaching online, and I'm old enough that I began teaching when message boards first really got going, what I realized is that a lot of the students who weren't saying anything in class actually had a ton to say when I moved the conversation out of class. But I was creating a barrier for them being able to show how much they know, and to them being able to shape the conversation in class by grading participation the way that I did. So the change that I made according to universal design is that I now give students a kind of a long laundry list of valuable ways to participate. And that can include taking notes, right? That can include peer review, can include finding contemporary cultural examples that illustrate a concept. It can be emailing with another group of students who might have missed a part of the class. So this whole much broader variety of ways to participate, all of which I actually do value much more than just shooting your hand up and talking, right? And the other piece is that students could then suggest to me other valuable ways of participating. They basically write a short reflective email to me a couple of times through the semester, and they're allowed to tell me the valuable ways that they've participated. The result is that my laundry list of useful forms of participation expands every semester. And I can give students that kind of menu of options at the beginning of each term, and it continues to grow, right? They assess that themselves. A lot of those ways of participating as well are about accessibility, right? It's forms of transcribing, note sharing, and so we're sharing in the commitment to accessibility. So that's one of my examples of how I've taken a piece that's often 15 or 20% of my grade that I assessed for years and that many people continue to assess without ever really interrogating the barriers that are created by it or the fairness of it, right? And by approaching it with these universal design principles, I was able to change what I was doing. And the result then is better for all students, and it's better for the class. I think we share our learning better. I get a better sense of what students are actually learning, right? I don't only hear from a few students, I hear from most people. You know, so it fits that kind of philosophy. So I'm hoping that maybe other people can share similar examples, or I'm also willing to share more examples of how we take, you know, we move away from that steep steps approach where we're assessing all the time, and we're doing it in a very conservative or traditional way, to thinking about expanding what we do, in the sense, in the spirit of these tunnels, right? To make accessibility foundational to what we're doing.
In the chat, MB Leaper wrote, I found the same thing when I was teaching online, much better way to evaluate. And then I actually teach a few classes for one of the departments. And so I recognize that some of my students need deadlines, but some students have trouble meeting deadlines. So I don't advertise it, but I have deadlines listed in the syllabus and in our online learning system. But after the deadline passes, I actually just remove the deadline. And so anybody who needs to turn something in late doesn't get penalized. So I did that a while ago. And so the people who like having that strict rigidity of this is when it's due, that's there for them. But people that need a bit more time, I have that in there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we look at universal design for learning, there's basically three organizing principles. One is multiple means of representation, right? So that is, we're not just lecturing, we're sharing ways to take notes, we're giving out lecture notes, we're returning and repeating ourselves, right? That idea of redundancy is so powerful and important in education. And that gives the people who are learning a lot of different ways to get the important information, right? Multiple means of expression is the second piece, and that's just lots of ways to give learners the ability to show what they know. And I think extending deadlines or being flexible around deadlines, if the goal is for people to be able to show what they've learned, and a really good instructor should want to get a genuine sense of that, right? They shouldn't want to get bad results. If they're teaching, they want to be able to see truly whether students understand what they're being taught and can share what they know. And so that idea of being a little more flexible around deadlines, if the goal is for students to be given that right to show what they know, then why would we not be more flexible around deadlines, right? And the final piece is multiple means of engagement. So that is ways to engage students in and out, and especially importantly outside of the classroom, right? So that we motivate students so that they're engaged in a community of learners, so that they're collaborating, right? Then that if we can do those three things, those three kind of principles, that's the idea behind universal design for learning. Okay, and this is interesting too. There's a comment here I see around students being scared to be wrong, right? And that's another big piece of the multiple means of expression, is that students are not wrong to believe that they're just constantly being assessed. Developing low stakes ways for students to share their ideas without fear of being wrong, or with an understanding that it's okay to be wrong, is really important, right? So I think that this strategy of having a spokesperson for the group to give the group's answer, so the fear of being wrong, if not removed, at least distributed across the group, I think is terrific. Another really important thing that I do is in a classroom, give students anonymous ways to ask questions. Whether that's, I sometimes hand out note cards, right? And students can just write questions down on the note card, and then I gather them, and it's anonymous, right? Nobody knows who asked the question. That's how you get the best questions. Online, we can use all kinds of different things. There's all kinds of different technology now that allow us to do that anonymous, whether it's through a Google Doc or Mentimeter or message boards or chat, to make anonymous the feedback. That's so important, and I think something that I know that I've developed later on in my career, but that I make sure that I'm doing almost every day in class.
We have a comment in the chat. The only issue with not having deadlines is that it's not reality in the quote real world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's always a kind of push and pull, right? And I don't think I'm not, I would never suggest not having a deadline. But the other piece for me is so often the deadlines are for large projects that are very deeply assessed, but not really deeply taught. So to me, I think it's okay to have a hard deadline as long as there's an earlier deadline and that there's earlier scaffolding and work put in to help students draft and revise their work, right? So that, in fact, it sounds counterintuitive, but having some flexible, having more deadlines, each of which is flexible, is a more egalitarian way of dealing with the idea of having a deadline. Because it can be really very difficult for students when the deadline that we give them is the final deadline. There's no chance to make that work better after that deadline. It's just going to be assessed. That's drastically different than saying, I'll take your rough drafts and I won't grade them, but I'll give you feedback on them in an earlier stage. Or to even have students able to do some peer review so that they can see and get some feedback before we give them the final grading deadline, right? So I don't know how to put it, but a deadline that is for a product to be submitted for final evaluation is just a drastically different and much more stressful and anxiety producing deadline than having more internal deadlines, but that have nothing to do with being graded or assessed, simply are about gathering feedback. And I hope I made sense, but to me, it's that second kind of deadline that's a real world deadline, right? We have deadlines to get things to other people so that they can read them and change them, right, and alter them. We're not being tested constantly in that way, but we do have deadlines and responsibility and accountability to other people with whom we're working. Other questions or ideas or comments? While I'm waiting, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I do want to point out, okay, so my book, Academic Ableism, it's, as Tom mentioned at the beginning, it's free and available online, so you can just go in, doesn't cost anything, just you can have a look. But the thing I wanted to point out is that as an addendum to that book, there's a list of, hundreds of these kind of ideas for teaching. And they are adapted to a wide range of different classroom types and settings. And any of those things, I'm putting the link up here, or maybe Tom can flip if you're not seeing my slides, but these are all a kind of place where you can start. Any of these kind of techniques can be things you could try in the classroom at any point in time. I do have a kind of evangelical motivation around this. I do believe that if more people tried these kinds of techniques, some of the ones we've talked about today, some of the ones that are gathered on that resource, then they really would see how much more clear their role as a teacher becomes, right? How it begins to pull away some of the things that really are just common practice but under-examined. How it frees us to do more teaching and less assessing, more connecting with students and less assessing, and that we, you all are the kind of people who will come on a Thursday afternoon, a beautiful Thursday afternoon, and spend time for an hour working on your teaching, which means you probably are already the sorts of people who do these kinds of things. But if we can do them, if we can document them, if we can reward one another for doing them, then that is the evangelical idea, right? It becomes like a kind of gateway drug. Sorry, bad metaphor, but people will try more of this, right? And that is the way that we can kind of slowly begin to change the culture. I guess that would be my challenge, is to try some of these things, but also to try to share some of these ideas with your colleagues.
We got about 2 minutes left.
2 minutes more, yeah.
Is it okay if I give out your email address again like we did
Please,
yesterday?
yeah, that's what I offered yesterday, and I'd like to offer that again. Like I said, practicing what we preach here, other ways to ask questions and participate aside from just putting your hand up, please email me. I would love to connect with people. And I really actually do love these questions that maybe come from specific disciplines where you are feeling like you really want to push forward on this stuff, but you're feeling some pushback. Those kinds of more tricky, complicated issues are exactly the kind of thing I love to hear about and I'd love to help you with. So please do reach out and email me because I would like to continue to connect.
Awesome. Well, unless there's any other, Angie or Evan, you see any last minute questions that I'm not seeing?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay. Well, unless there's no other questions, I guess we'll wrap up here. Dr. Dolmage, this has been a real pleasure having you. We appreciate the last 2 days. I think this is really, at least for me, moved or at least heightened the bar in terms of how we look at accessibility and inclusion for our students with disabilities, and I think is definitely generating a lot of thought. So we really appreciate you being with us, and hope we can have you again sometime to speak with our entire staff and faculty, maybe when we're in person. That would be really nice.
I would love that. I would love to. So thank you everybody for your time, and good luck getting through the term. Thanks, Tom, so much, and yeah, I hope that we can continue to connect.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.